So Exodus 16 through 19 is like a mini travel narrative. It's the story of the Israelites going from the Red Sea to Mount Sinai. Now, when we get to the book of Numbers, which you will read over the weekend for me, there's going to be a long travel narrative, which is them going from Mount Sinai to the plains of Moab on the east side of the Jordan River, right before they cross over into the Promised Land. And you'll see, like, there are some parallels, right? Like, there's a similar story. So, like the story we talked about last time in Exodus 17 about God telling Moses, right, to with his staff hit the rock and water comes out. And now in the travel narrative, we get almost the exact same story, but it's Moses is supposed to speak to the rock that time, and he hits the rock anyway. So there are some similar stories between these travel narratives. So like Exodus 16 to 19 is like a mini travel narrative, and then in Numbers you get like this big long travel narrative. But very similar things are happening in the same thing, which is basically like the Israelites complaining. Essentially, that's what's happening in the narrative. This is of course a familiar story about God sending manna to them in the wilderness when they didn't have any food. Bread, it's described as bread. Do you see that? Verse 31. The people of Israel called the bread man. Not really manna. They called it man. But you see that? Unquestionably, it's called bread. Where does it come from? So, it's bread. It comes from where? A light bulb should have just gone off inside your brain. Right. Right. Jesus says, I am the bread from heaven. What do you make of that? We've just read the story. When Jesus says, I'm the bread from heaven, he's talking about this story. This man. This is the bread from heaven. So let's just sit with this for a minute. What is this? When Jesus says, I'm the bread, what does he mean about himself? And what does he mean about this story? Right, this is not just salvation in the abstract, right? Like, not like salvation from sin. This is the people, they're in a desert like that. They really are going to die if they don't get food to eat, and quickly. Good, what else?
Too much or too little.
I like that a lot, yeah. Right? Yeah, I like that. There is, that, right? There's responsibility to share, right? Two questions I asked are, what is the fact that Jesus says, I am the bread from heaven? What does this mean about Jesus? We've answered that, but what does it mean about this story in Exodus? What do you think? Yes?
It's somewhat of a type, like the type and antitype kind of thing. This is providing like an image that is fully meaningful to its time, but then also looking forward to when Jesus is the antitype of that, or the fulfillment of that image.
I really like that. Go a little bit further, though. So if the manna that appears in the desert to the Israelites is a type of Jesus, what does that mean for the Israelites? If this is bread that comes from heaven, are the Israelites eating the body of Jesus? It all comes down to like, how literally do we understand, right? Like when Jesus says, I am the bread of heaven, like how literally do we interpret that statement? Yeah. Right? Right. It's similar like what at the Last Supper, right? When Jesus raises a piece of bread and says, this is my body, right? Like how literally do we understand that statement of Jesus? Okay, now we have plenty of time right now, so I'm going to stop for just a few minutes. Why am I asking you these questions about the bread and Jesus, and why am I asking you this right now? Right? What Jesus says the Old Testament is about is not obvious. right? It wasn't even obvious to his disciples. It wasn't obvious to first century Jews, right? Jesus had to take the Bible and explain, okay, this is how, you guys, this is how you see me in the Old Testament. How the Old Testament is preparing you for me to come. So, we are wise as Christians to listen to the words of Jesus as we are reading the Old Testament and looking for these types of connections. It is saying this bread, I don't think Jesus means for us to be like, oh, this was actually Jesus on the ground and they're eating Jesus. I don't think that's how the Israelites thought about manna, and I don't think that's how Jesus intends us to think about manna in the Old Testament. But I think Jesus does mean to say, well, look at the kind of deliverance, rescue, salvation, whatever term you want to look for, what God did for the Israelites here in this desert. By giving them bread from heaven, what did God do for them? And then Jesus says, that's what I'm like. I am this bread from heaven. And if you read John, like what Andy was saying, right, there's more statements that Jesus makes like this. He says, I am the light of the world. He says, I am the resurrection. He says, I am the way. Right? There's all these statements, all these theological statements that are in the Gospel of John, are directly tied to events that happen in the Old Testament. All right, now notice the other thing is right? They kept a basket, an omer of manna, and they put it into the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of the Testimony, with the tablets of the Covenant Law. Notice the tablets of the Covenant Law aren't around yet. In fact, the Ark of the Testimony isn't around yet. So I'm pointing out this detail. Remember, I told you a while back in Genesis that you can't read all the details of Hebrew narrative as strictly chronological. Right? There's all kinds of stuff happening with time. Which, as you're reading this narrative, things can allude to things in the future. Things can also allude to things in the past. It happens all the time. In Hebrew narratives. Hebrew narratives, they were not strict about organizing their stories chronologically. They just had different ways of organizing their stories. All right. And now we get, this is the first incidence we have something like this, where God is telling Moses to write something down on a scroll and start to keep it. Now, as we go through the Old Testament, you'll see this over and over again. Right? This is apparently, if we take the biblical narrative at its word, it's with Moses when these writings begin to start being written down and collected, that eventually form, right, the book. In a few chapters, in just a few minutes, we'll see it's called the Book of the Covenant. But then it has all sorts of different names. Sometimes it's called Book of the Law. Sometimes it's called Book of the Law of Moses. Sometimes it's called the Book of the Law of Yahweh. Sometimes it's called the Book of Yahweh. But they're starting to collect these things. They keep it in the tabernacle, right? They keep this scroll, these sacred writings. And as Israelite culture progresses, more and more people begin to, more of writings are collected, recognized as inspired by God and included into this canon. Does this make sense? This is pretty important in Old Testament history, right? This is where the tradition comes from of Moses being the one who writes the first 5 books of the... This is where it comes from. Moses is the one who's starting to put these things together actually in writing, in written form, and preserving them.